Friends, welcome to the Puffin Cultural Forum and our ongoing series on interviews with noted writers. And we certainly have a noted writer with us this afternoon. Before we get to Jonathan Alter, let me just introduce myself. I'm Joseph Chuman. I'm a leader of the New York Society for Ethical Culture and recently retired as the leader of the Ethical Culture in Society in TNEC after 46 years. I'm also a professor of human rights, teaching in the graduate school at Columbia University and at the City University, specifically at Hunter College. And I've taught for the United Nations at its University for Peace in Costa Rica, also in the field of human rights. So you can imagine that a discussion about Jimmy Carter, which I'm about to have with our guest, is of special interest to me because of Carter's exemplary commitment to human rights during his presidency and afterwards. We're very privileged this afternoon to have Mr. Jonathan Alter as our guest. Mr. Alter is a former senior editor of Newsweek. He is the author of 3 New York Times bestsellers, 2 of them on the presidency of Barack Obama, and 1 of them on the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. As noted, this afternoon we're going to be talking about the presidency of another illustrious resident of the Oval Office, and that's Jimmy Carter. I'll be interviewing Jonathan Alter on his recently published book, his very best, here it is, his very best, Jimmy Carter, A Life. Jonathan Alter, we're very pleased to have you with us. Good afternoon.
Thanks so much for having me, Joe.
Okay, it's a real privilege and a joy. A few basic questions before we actually get to the content of the text. As mentioned, the book was published in 2020. It's simply a magisterial piece of work approaching 800 pages. And I'm always interested in the craft of writing. So my first question is a sort of general one about writing and your writing. How in the world did you put this book together? How many interviews did you have? How did you go about the research? And you did interview Jimmy Carter himself on it. I'd like you to talk a little bit behind the scenes about the process of constructing an 800-page book.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me.
My pleasure.
It's not really 800 pages. It's
800 well,
pages.
Okay. It does have an index and
well, not just an index, but like endnotes and the endnotes in a book like this are about 150 pages, or 140 pages. So it's less than 700 pages, maybe 650 pages. I'm not exactly sure how long the text is, but I don't want people to get intimidated by the length. And, after Carter got sick earlier this year, my publisher, Simon & Schuster, went back on the presses and they printed thousands of new copies, but they had to do it so fast because of the interest that the new paperback looks twice as long as the old paperback. It looks like a brick, and it really is of concern to me because I made a lot of effort to have the book be very readable. The critics all said it was readable, and the last thing that I wanted it to be was some kind of a slog. And I cut 100,000 words out of it.
My goodness.
At my publisher's request. So the original version was longer than 800 words, 800 pages. But I cut a lot because I wanted the story to move. In terms of how I did it, so this is my 4th book. So I had a little bit of a system. Every author develops their own rituals, and the first one, I think most authors would agree, is the hardest, even though my first one, which was about Franklin Roosevelt, was significantly shorter. And I saw Jimmy Carter at a book club event, this book club that I'm in New York. I thought there's got to be more to this guy after spending an evening with him than, lousy president, great former president. And actually, that night, we were talking about a book that was written by Lawrence Wright called 13 Days in September about the Camp David Accords, which I have a whole chapter on, long chapter in my book, long but fast moving. And But that night when we met former President Carter, who was 90 years old at the time in 2015, we talked quite a bit about human rights as well and what had happened in Latin America in the 10 years after he left office, which is basically that, when he was in office, Venezuela was the only democracy in Latin America. And today, yes, Venezuela is the only country that is not a democracy in Latin America. And that change isn't all due to Jimmy Carter. But after this evening that we spent with him, I was convinced that he deserves much more credit than he's received for what he did on human rights, and that there had to be more to this guy beyond human rights than, mediocre president, outstanding saintly former president. So by good fortune, my editor at Simon and Schuster and Jimmy Carter's editor was the same person, the late great nonfiction editor Alice Mayhew, who had been Bob Woodward, and Carl Bernstein, and David McCullough, Doris Kearns Goodwin, and Walter Isaacson. She edited a lot of nonfiction writers. And so she, because she had this longstanding relationship with Carter, she cleared the way. So I had tremendous access to Carter and his entire family. And I interviewed him many times for the book. And I interviewed everybody in his family as well, and about 250 other people. So in part because I'm a journalist by background, and in part because the Carter administration is in living memory, unlike my Roosevelt book, this one, it was more like the Obama books. It was full of a lot of interviews, but because the events were so many years ago, I'd usually get maybe one or two things from an interview that I could possibly use. And I don't like larding up my manuscript with a lot of quotes anyway. I think that gets in the way of storytelling. And so, ultimately, the document work at the Carter Library was, and the Georgia State Archive, where a lot of his papers from when he was governor are, that was more important. So I launched in 2015, and in I made a decision to interview people in an actuarial fashion, because a lot of them were very old. So, I went and started interviewing Carter really before I was fully ready to, but I was worried. Sounds kind of funny 8 years later, but I was worried that, he could die at any time. And I wanted to make sure that I interviewed him. And I did the same thing with Zbigniew Brzezinski, his national security advisor, who died not long after I interviewed him, and Harold Brown, same thing happened with him, and several other people. So that approach really served me well. There were only a few people who I got to too late. And I would urge anybody who's writing a book about events that took place, in the last 50 years to do their interviewing of older people before they're maybe ready to do it, just so that they can not have a problem with mortality. And then, I think the other part of my process, which I'm almost a little bit loath to explain, because I think people think of it as very a little strange, but I developed it when I was on extremely tight deadlines for my Obama books. I wrote both of those books in 18 months, which is really, that's from when I started to when it was published. So the actual writing of them was more like a year. And in both, the Promise, my first book about Obama, and The Center Holds, my sequel, I wrote them really fast. So I had to figure out how to develop certain shortcuts, and I just got in the habit of doing this. And what I did is I don't work well when I'm looking at a blank page. It's very hard, even for a professional writer, somebody like me who had to do that every week at Newsweek for almost 30 years. But it's daunting for anybody to look at a blank page. So what I do instead is I transfer my notes, say the notes that I'm taking in an interview, the ones with Jimmy Carter and a few and Rosalind Carter and a few other people are tape recorded, but the vast majority of them are not, because I'm not interested in exact quotes from them. And if they say something that it's just different than journalism, I'm trying to tell a historical story. So if they say something that is really much better than I could ever say it in my own words, if they, for instance, Brzezinski talking about Jimmy Carter having 3 smiles, not the exact quote. What I do is at the end of the process, I go back and I check the quotes with the person who I interviewed in order to get them accurate. But I don't have, these long tapes that I have to transcribe. So I build a database where I mine my notebooks and the documents that I've taken literally thousands of photographs of at an archive. I was just doing this at the University of Illinois this week. And, the trick there in terms of research is you don't read really any documents when you're in the archive. If you're skimming it and it looks interesting, you just take photographs of it, and so you end up with thousands of photographs. And then at your leisure later on, I went back and started organizing the documents that I had perused, and realizing that many of them were of no use to me. But it was better that I erred on the side of taking the photographs of the documents, and then organized those documents into the likely chapters that they will relate to in my outline. Same thing with the interview material. And then I'm telling you much more than you really want to know. So cut me off at any time.
Okay. Yes, actually, I do want to get to the content of the book, although this is
I was just going to say
this
that.
is very important. And
Yeah,
for those people
let me
out
just
there
finish. Let me just finish the one thing, because
sure, of course.
I may have piqued people's curiosity about the process, and I need
Yes.
to just finish it. So instead of looking at a blank page, I have a chapter, basically dump of notes, sentences, half paragraphs. And let's say I envision a chapter being about 5,000 to 6,000 words. This chapter database, it might be 10,000 words, but a lot of them are scraps. But then all I have to do to actually come up with a chapter is rewrite those notes, cut, rearrange, and suddenly I have at least a rough draft of a chapter, and I haven't had to look at a blank.
Well, yeah, sounds like your experience editor for Newsweek came in handy in terms of authoring a book.
Yeah, I was mostly a writer. I mean, I had a senior editorial position, but most of it.
Right. Okay, before we get to the content, there's one more question I want to ask you, is sort of briefly about this, and it's a bit personal. I read the book and I was very struck with your tone and your treatment of Jimmy Carter. It's not hagiographic. You don't turn him into a person whom he was not. You express both his virtues and his liabilities and vulnerabilities. And I'm wondering, since you had met him and he had given you material, is it difficult personally to write a biography of someone who is still alive, in effect, and basically treat him in ways that are not exclusively complimentary? Is that difficult to do? Were you afraid of perhaps hurting his feelings, insulting him? And has he read the book? And if so, what has been his response?
Well, on the latter question, so he listened to the book because he had a fall in late
Yeah.
2019, about a year before the book came out, and he doesn't see well. So I had to stop, everybody else had to stop emailing with him, which I
Right.
used to do to check facts regularly. So he listened to the book with Rosalind, his wife of 77, almost 77 years now. And he never gave me directly any kind of reaction. I did hear that he wished I had done a little more on his post presidency, and there's less of that than I would have liked, because when I was cutting, I just thought that was, I have a lot about that, but I cut there. He liked it enough that my wife and I were invited to their 75th wedding anniversary in
Oh,
Plains, Georgia, where Nancy Pelosi and the Clintons and
well, that
other
says
people
something. Yeah.
went, even though they didn't have a good relationship with the Clintons, to put it mildly, which is in the book. Um, my main reaction came from Mrs. Carter, and she said, and I'm going to try to do a little imitation of her now that I hope the Southerners who might be watching don't get too bent out of shape about. So, because I really have enormous respect for Rosalind Carter, who I think was one of the most formidable first ladies in American history and powerful first ladies in American history. And so her reaction to the book was, well, Jonathan had some pretty critical things to say about Jimmy, but he only said nice things about me. Which was actually entirely true, because I didn't,
Yes, you did. Yes.
all that and it's because I couldn't really, there was nothing that she did that was worthy of criticism, whereas there were a number of things that her
Yes.
husband did that were worthy of criticism. So your only obligation in these things, whether you're writing a book or an article or anything, is to your reader. And if you try to worry about the feelings of the person that you're writing about, or you try to, sugarcoat something that shouldn't be sugarcoated, you are doing a disservice to your reader. And that's the only obligation. Having
Right.
said that, I was very open. I showed chapters of this to people in the Carter circle. And for instance, Mrs. Carter, she gave me the love letters, quite steamy love letters that Jimmy Carter wrote her from the Navy. And, but we struck a deal, which is that she could see the context, right? And his longtime aide, Steve Hockman, read quite a bit of the book. And I did this, by the way, on my other books as well. That you don't show advance drafts if you're writing an article. That's not kosher in journalism. So I wouldn't send my Newsweek articles to the person I was writing about, whether it was a president or somebody else. I interviewed 9 out of the last 10 presidents, either before, during, or after leaving office when I was at Newsweek. But a book is different. So what I try to do in the interest of fairness is I was crazy about the idea of correcting factual errors, which is why I sent these chapters to people, because it drives me crazy if there's anything that is factually inaccurate. So my main effort was to get it as right as possible. And everybody I sent it to found at least something that they thought was, a little bit off. But I also was open to their interpretive, criticism. So, and sometimes I would change something and sometimes I wouldn't, depending on the quality of the criticism. So for instance, Carter's aide objected, not objected, but he, one of his notes was that, was it fair to call Jimmy Carter's father a white supremacist? And some other people also raised that. Aren't you engaging in, presentism? Because so many people at that time, shared his views. And, I thought about it and I said, you know what? He was a white supremacist. So I'm not going to accept your note, And so I think that even though he had real struggles with his father, which is the first chapter is about that, I think Carter was not entirely happy with the way I portrayed his father, but that's something that I'm entirely comfortable with.
Yes. Okay, let's move on to the content of Jimmy Carter's life per se. You mentioned his father. Can you talk about Jimmy Carter? The book is actually organized chronologically. Can you basically talk about Carter's early life, his childhood in rural southern Georgia, the people around him? And then I want to move into what you basically come to at various points in the book Jimmy Carter's problems with race. But let's talk first about the context of his upbringing and who some of the exemplary and formative influences were in his early life.
So Jimmy Carter was born in 1924, and his family had no indoor plumbing, um, no mechanized farm equipment, no electricity until he was 11 years old. And so he might as well have been living in the 19th
Mhm.
century or earlier. But his family was well to do by local standards. And his father was not just a farmer, but a merchant. And he was a white supremacist who wouldn't let Jimmy's black playmates into the house after they reached puberty. And even if there were black church leaders who he respected, they couldn't enter his home. He talked to them outside, and all of the rest of the um, really, in some ways, still shocking dimensions of Jim Crow segregation, but which Earl Carter upheld. Lillian Carter's mother was a nurse who was the only person in Sumter County with anything nice to say about Abraham Lincoln, and she took care of black patients for free. And but he really had a third parent, a woman named Rachel Clark, an illiterate black woman farmhand, and she gave him much of his love of nature that led him to become one of our greatest environmental presidents, as well as much of his faith. And he was one of the most devout men ever to hold the Oval Office. And his childhood ambition was to be in the Navy, an admiral in the Navy. He always had high ambitions, very ambitious. And after some struggles, he went to the U.S. Naval Academy, where he was viciously hazed, but protected the first black midshipman ever to go to the Naval Academy, who was a couple of years behind him, which was unusual for anybody, but especially of doing the right thing at an early age. And then when he was in the Navy, he once again, there were incidents where he protected black shipmates. And his he had many formative experiences in those years. He was a protege of Admiral Hyman Rickover, the father of the nuclear navy, who Colin Powell said won the Cold War because he developed nuclear powered submarines that the Soviets could never match, so we could stay underwater forever. And Carter worked on one of the prototypes of those submarines. We had nuclear power on ships before we had it on land. He had to race into a melted down nuclear reactor in Canada, risking his life. So a lot happened, but then when his father died, he left the Navy and returned and assumed his father's civic positions and business positions in Southwest Georgia, and ducked the civil rights movement because he could not be both successful in business and then later successful in local politics and be part of the civil rights movement. And as he told me, I never claimed to be part of the civil rights movement. And it got bad in 1970 when he ran for governor for the second time. And he ran as a conservative Democrat, and needed the rural segregationist vote. And he didn't say anything bigoted, because he was not a bigot, and there were lines that he would not cross. But he used what are called dog whistles or code words, and he said he promised, turned out he didn't keep this promise, that he would bring George Wallace, the governor of neighboring Alabama, into the state. He paid a call on the founder of the White Citizens Council, which is a segregationist business organization, sending these signals that they could rely on him to be a segregationist if he was elected. And then very interesting thing happened on the last day of his campaign. He had been flown around the state by a Jewish pilot, very eccentric, who had helped make him governor because he didn't have the money to get all over the state of Georgia, which is big. And this supporter flew him around. And this guy was a big supporter of the movement and of the King family, quite close to the King family. His name is David Rabhan. And he had earlier in the campaign introduced Carter to Daddy King. Martin Luther King was dead by that point, Martin Luther King Jr. Carter never met him. I did when I was 8 years old, came to my house in Chicago, but Carter never did. And he met Daddy King, who was for his opponent, but they had a good meeting. And Daddy King later became one of his most devoted supporters. And on the last day of the campaign, he said to the pilot, businessman, "You've done so much for me, flying me around the state. Is there anything I can do for you?" And he said, "Yeah, take out that flight manual," is the only paper they had. "Here's a pencil. I want you to write this down. The time for racial discrimination is over. Sign it and say it in your inaugural address." And Carter did. So shortly after he was sworn in as governor of Georgia, just moments after, at the very beginning of his speech, he says this. And it sounds like nothing today, but in 1971, it was a huge deal. And the whites thought he had betrayed them. And the black folks in the audience, where he said, "What?" They couldn't believe it. And he went on to integrate Georgia state government, appoint all these black judges. He hung Martin Luther King Jr.'s portrait in the state capitol. And he became the Jimmy Carter that we know today. So this is a man who basically on race spent the second half of his life from the time he was 50 to today, making up for what he did not do in the first half of his life.
Yeah, he was very self-conscious about that too. He was very troubled by it, wasn't it? And felt almost a need to atone for his
Yes,
earlier currying of
yes,
favor with racists. I mean, today, talk about presentism and
yeah.
cancel culture. That type of history 50 years later would hold him in very bad stead, really place him in a very bad light that he had
Well,
spent
I'm
his
not.
younger years currying the favor of Lester Maddox and George
Well,
Wallace and those types of really heinous people who have written or are off the charts from a progressive or leftist perspective.
so he did not curry favor with Lester Maddox. He lost to Lester Maddox when he ran against him in 1966.
Okay.
He despised Lester Maddox. Lester Maddox became lieutenant governor when he was governor, and they just fought for
Okay.
4 years. And excuse me one second. And and when he ran for president, he was seen as the face of the New South. Everybody at that time had, something like this. So you can't really, it would be interesting. And he had the African American community was the only voting bloc that stuck with him. They were extremely loyal to him, and because his childhood playmates had been black, and he was enormously comfortable around, and still is around. He has a mostly black Secret Service detail. This is who he is often most comfortable with, and of course, he's a hero in Africa, where children are named after him, and he's
Sure.
gone to Africa more than any other president by many times. And
Okay.
so, but I'm saying, I think your word atonement, though, is the right one. And I, on several occasions, tried to use that in my conversations with him. And he wouldn't actually cop to that. But he did say, he said, my quote, "My late awareness, led me to do different things in after I became governor of Georgia." And it's that part of the story to me is absolutely fascinating, and it relates to George Floyd in that after George Floyd was murdered, Carter issued a statement that essentially said silence equals death, and better late than never. Like
Right.
the issue is not, are you late? Should you be canceled for being late? He would say no. It's, what are you doing now for racial justice? That's the test. And I think he's quite right about that.
Yeah. Okay. I want to move on to another sort of central topic. You make a point rather explicitly that Carter had no definable political ideology. And you note that he was not a New Deal Democrat, right? He was very much a centrist. And as I see it, a pragmatist. I'm wondering, having gotten to know him, and you do talk about his persona, what in effect moved him? What was his center of gravity politically? Um,
Well, I think he did have. I mean, he would reject the idea of ideology because he's an
mhm,
engineer, and engineers want to
right.
fix problems, not you know
Okay.
it's virtue signal, or even though people accused him of virtue signaling, but he was a problem solver. I think in some ways the president that he resembles the most is Theodore Roosevelt, both because of his passion on the environment. Carter was a fantastic environmental governor of Georgia and signed 15 major pieces of environmental legislation as president, and he doubling the size of the national park system. So, and he also was a kind of a progressive Republican, turn of the century reformer. So you had the first civil service reform in 100 years, uh, deregulation that wasn't like today's right wing deregulation, but deregulation that he did with Ted Kennedy that was in the interests of consumers, not just airlines, but trucking deregulation lowered, eventually created just in time delivery, lowered prices, and then a kind of a an ethical standard which is core to him. You ask what's in his core: decency, honesty, um, respect for human rights and democracy, and peace. So it's peace first. So at the end of his presidency, Walter Mondale toasted him. We kept the peace. We told the truth. We obeyed the law. And at the time, you'd go, well, isn't that the lowest standard possible? Today, we know if you have a president who kept the peace, no shots fired in anger for the first time since Thomas Jefferson, uh,
Mhm.
told the truth, never lied. Think about that in today's context, and obeyed the law. And Carter always would add a fourth one. He'd say, and we promoted human rights. So
Mhm.
peace, human rights, the environment, ethics, these are what were at his core, not redistribution or I mean, he expanded Social Security. He wasn't against the New Deal, but he didn't have the New Deal in his bones. And his father had been a big opponent of the New Deal after he voted for Roosevelt the first time, because one of the things they did in the 30s to keep agricultural prices up is they made farmers slaughter their livestock, especially pigs. And Earl Carter thought that was pretty crazy, and you might not have been wrong about that.
Yeah, I want to talk to you. I mean, it's fascinating in terms of, I mean, this sort of approach that in terms of centering his presidency on these values, being an engineer, and so on and so forth, gives Carter and his lack of explicit ideology and fervor in that regard makes him somewhat difficult to pin down or to put
Right.
into categories, right, in that regard. But one thing we do know about him, you mentioned Theodore Roosevelt, who was very religious, is that Carter was probably the most religious president we had in the 20th century. He said in his inauguration he was a born again Christian. I suspect northern journalists had to go to their religion dictionaries to know what that was about. Right? Evangelicals at first loved him. He was one of their own. I've always believed, and maybe it's naive, that Carter is basically a very decent moral man, and
Yeah.
that he basically tried to transfer the best of his religious commitments. And of course, evangelicals, I think, have atrophied into nothing but a right wing, political movement who've forgotten Jesus. But in effect, he tried to take the best of his religious values and transpose them into his political life and into his presidency. That may sound a little naive, but I'm wondering if you can talk about his religious commitments and how they may have informed his political orientation, the values, the four values that you just mentioned, and so forth, because it seems to me that it was highly significant and
Yes. I
really
mean, he
speaks
was
very well of the man. It's hard to be moral and be president of the United States, but I think he tried to do that, and so
no
forth. Yeah,
question he tried
right.
to do that. And a lot of that had to do with the circumstances under which he was elected. He never would have been elected without Watergate, and he was seen as a breath of fresh air. And he ran on that. He said, "I'll never lie to you. We need a government as good as its people. We're a good people, and we need to be decent and moral." And he didn't, I think a lot of people sort of wrongly remember that he was sanctimonious. And he actually
Okay.
was a strong believer in the separation of church and state. His first speech, when he was first elected to the Georgia State Senate, after his opponent literally stuffed the ballot boxes and he had to go to court, was about the separation of church and state. And one of the ways he ran afoul of the evangelicals when he was president is that he wouldn't give Bob Jones University, allow them to have the tax breaks that colleges get because they discriminated, and there were many other examples, but he did infuse. He was so personally committed to a moral appeal that I think his human rights policy, which he said in his farewell address, he said, "America did not invent human rights. Human rights invented America." That's how central these ideas were. And he in terms of his own speeches, the famous so-called malaise speech in 1979, we never used that word malaise. They called it the crisis of confidence speech. But it really, it almost could have been delivered from the pulpit. And it was a Jeremiad against materialism and against us losing our souls in a consumerist culture. And then sometimes he would talk to foreign leaders about this. So unfortunately, there's no independent verification of this from a note taker or a communique or anything like that normally would be a diplomatic document that one could rely on. So I have to take this on Carter's authority. But he says that when, on the last day of Deng Xiaoping's historic visit in 1979, and it was Carter and Deng who normalized relations between the US and China, which was much more important than people have realized. It's the foundation of our global economy, this bilateral relationship. Deng Xiaoping goes back to China and legalizes private property the next week, and they have the greatest growth in human history. And it grows out of not just Nixon opening the door, but Carter actually establishing a relationship. And when he's just about to leave, he says, like the pilot I was just mentioning, he says, "President Carter, you've been so gracious on this visit. Is there anything I can do for you?" And Carter says, "When I was a boy, I sent a nickel every month to Baptist missionaries in China." And he knew the names of one of them was a famous woman Baptist missionary. And he said, "Can't you let missionaries and Bibles and churches into China?" And Deng Xiaoping said, "Well, let me think about that, and I'll tell you the next day as I'm leaving." And so just before he leaves, he says, "We can't let missionaries into China. They were very damaging to our people 100, at that point, it was about 75 years earlier." He said, "But I see no reason why we can't have churches and Bibles in China. They would be churches that were state sanctioned, but nonetheless churches that worship God." And when Carter went back to China a couple of years later, there were 70 million new Chinese Christians, which would make Jimmy Carter the greatest missionary in human history.
Right. Well, we're talking about his religious values and bringing them into politics, but you don't depict, and I think it's to your credit, you don't depict Jimmy Carter as a saint. You mentioned he was sanctimonious. He comes across sometimes as being arrogant and headstrong. He certainly can be aloof. He doesn't play political games. He doesn't curry favor with those people whom he doesn't care for. It doesn't seem necessarily politically advantageous in a political climate. And I wanted to know, they say a picture speaks 1,000 words. I don't know if people can see this. You do have this photograph in the book, which I think is very telling. It's a reunion of the then living presidents, okay, the two Bushes, Barack Obama, okay, and Bill Clinton. And there's Jimmy Carter. And I suspect you chose this photograph because it is significant of Carter's personality. He's
Yeah.
standing alone. The four of them are huddling together. He's staring off into space by himself. And it suggests a type of aloofness. And I'm
Yeah.
wondering if you can comment on that. I mean, he was not a totally admirable person. He could be unpleasant. And I'm
Difficult.
wondering how that affected him politically. If you can say more about that. I mean, that caught my
So,
attention.
so
He
I
had his
don't,
negatives. He
oh,
was not a
totally.
saint. He's not a saint.
No, and he, I
He
actually
could
don't
sometimes be foul-mouthed too.
I don't think
Yeah.
he's sanctimonious. I don't know.
Well, you did use that phrase,
He said "fuck the
Jonathan. Yeah.
job," and and Harold Brown, as defense secretary, verified that for me.
Uh-huh.
He said it in his presence, but he would never say "God damn." That's something that Jimmy Carter would do.
That was
Uh,
be blasphemy, I suspect.
right in his mind. I don't actually think he was sanctimonious. Like if you
Oh,
spent time with him in private, you might think he was cold because if he was angry at you, those steely blues would go into you, and the temperature in the room would go down to 25 degrees. And he had the kind of the big public, somewhat, as Brzezinski said, he had three smiles, like a big public kind of somewhat phony smile. Then he had the tight-lipped smile that indicated he was angry or upset with you for some reason. He wasn't a yeller. And I got that on a few occasions. And then he had the genuine smile when somebody would, or he would say something that was amusing. He didn't think of himself as a politician. He doesn't think of himself as a politician. And his wife is a much better politician than he is. So he would make these political mistakes. I think people they lost sight of his core decency when they think he was acting in a difficult or high-handed way. And but I think most of his unpopularity came from external circumstances. I mean, if you have hostages being held in Iran, they were all released safely through his efforts after the election, unfortunately for him. Inflation and interest rates in double digits. Imagine if Biden right now were facing 13% inflation and 19% interest rates. 19%.
yeah.
People think they're high now, and so these things made it very difficult for him. And then somebody in his own party, Ted Kennedy, who he had a terrible relationship with, runs against him. So, like, imagine, I don't know what the example would be today, but imagine, Elizabeth Warren challenging Biden for the nomination. That would be very destructive to Biden's chances. And yet there is this myth that these political problems that he had prevented him from getting important things done, and that he would have gotten a lot more legislation if he had handled Congress differently. I challenge that assumption. So I think if he had handled things differently, he would have gotten more done. He might have gotten healthcare done if he'd gotten along with Ted Kennedy. And that has tragic consequences because that was doable. And people had to sell their homes if they had medical expenses all the way until Obamacare. And that was really unfortunate. But he actually got more bills signed in 4 years than either Obama or Clinton did in 8 years, in part because he had a Democratic Congress the whole time, and they only did for 2 years. And in part because the muscle of legislation was just more, the system worked better. So there were many things that he got accomplished. So I think the right way to assess his presidency is that he was a political failure, but a substantive and often visionary success. So I think people know about the solar panels on the roof of the White House, but it went way beyond that, which, by the way,
I think this is all very important in terms of understanding his accomplishments. and his legacy. I want to talk and delve a little bit into his ascendancy for the presidency. I mean, from the point of view of the average voter, he seemed to come from nowhere. As you point out, he was only the first governor since FDR to basically be able to win the White House. Can you trace his trajectory from his governorship to the White House politically? And if you can make a stop along the way in terms of his enmity and contention with Ted Kennedy, which you mentioned, and what that was all about.
Yeah.
Yep.
So he, from a very early point, he's only been governor for a year and a half when McGovern is nominated, and he tries to get on the ticket as vice president, but is seen as much too conservative. And he actually nominated Scoop Jackson for president at the 1972 convention, which is kind of hard to believe given what we know now about Scoop Jackson and Jimmy Carter. Scoop Jackson was a neocon.
Mhm.
And then right the night that Nixon wins a huge reelection in 1972, Carter begins his campaign secretly because it was preposterous almost for him to be thought of as running. And so he kept it a secret for a long time, but he was quietly organizing. And then he had the good fortune of being unemployed in 1975, the year before the election, because he couldn't run for governor of Georgia again under Georgia state law. And if he had, by the way, as he told me, admitted to me, he would have likely lost because he ticked off a lot of people in Georgia in the same way that he later did in Washington. But while getting a lot done, he broke a lot of China, and he was called Jungle Jimmy for his sharp elbows when he was governor. But when he was governor, he meets these national Democrats like Ted Kennedy and Edmund Muskie and Hubert Humphrey, and he thinks, I know more than they do about government because they don't understand what happens when these laws are passed. They're just in the Senate. They've never been a governor. And and then he learns about foreign policy through something called the Trilateral Commission that David Rockefeller put him on. And so he's educating himself. He did this when he ran for governor. He's studying. I mean, this idea that we have now that you can just like run for president, every week he's being tutored in what you would need to know to be a good president, an effective president. And he's campaigning in Iowa and New Hampshire relentlessly. And he was a brilliant retail campaigner. He wasn't a good politician as president because he thought politics should end after the election. But running for president, he was brilliant, especially in small groups. And they just out hustled the others. And he went from 0 in the polls to the Democratic nomination with some setbacks in between. As far as Ted Kennedy, so what happened there was in 1974, when Carter was still governor, Kennedy came down to give a speech at the University of Georgia Law School on behalf of Dean Rusk, who had been his brother's Secretary of State. And he brought with him Hunter Thompson, the gonzo journalist who journalists of my generation revered, just this crazy Rolling Stone writer. And Kennedy didn't know that Carter was thinking about running for president, but Carter decided he wanted to diss Kennedy, essentially made him drive to Athens, Georgia instead of fly like he thought he was going to. And then Kennedy gives a kind of a mediocre speech, and some of the others are giving boring speeches. And Hunter Thompson, I'll tell you in a second why I'm getting into detail on this. He goes to his car to get some wild turkey to refresh his iced tea, right? Because he's so bored by these speeches. And he would famously bring his drinking and everything into his journalism. And then Carter gets up and gives what became the best speech by many accounts, including mine, that he ever gave, where he attacks the criminal justice system in Georgia for what it does to Black people and for being, not loyal to what these lawyers and judges in attendance should be doing with their lives, looking out for people who need justice, not just corporations. It's a fantastic speech. And so Thompson goes to his car, and this time, in addition to getting the bourbon, he brings his tape recorder in and he gets most of this speech on tape. And for the next 2 years, he plays it for any reporter that he can find. And he writes these articles in Rolling Stone saying, this obscure guy, Jimmy Carter, he should be the next president. And Thompson had such authority among people like me, younger journalists. I was a little too young, but I was in college, but even I was affected by his Rolling Stone articles. And suddenly, everybody's talking about this obscure former governor of Georgia. And meanwhile, he and Kennedy have gotten off on the wrong foot. They were like oil and water. Kennedy thought he was so cold to him on that visit. And in his memoirs, he writes about how they could never get along after that. And there's a long, I think, really compelling story that I tell about these two major figures of that time and how tragically they were not able to get along with each other. There's enough blame to go around.
Yeah. Okay. I do want to move to foreign policy. Okay. There are four big issues I want to talk about that you deal with in discrete chapters at great length. First, let's talk about highly controversial in its day, the Panama Canal Treaty, and what Carter's vision was there and the fallout from that.
So when I first, was working on the book, I'm thinking, oh, the Panama Canal treaties, that sounds so boring, but it turns out that if these treaties had not been approved, which was a very, very heavy lift, these treaties turned over the operation of the canal to the Panamanians. Meanwhile, Ronald Reagan is coming to national prominence by saying, we built it, we paid for it, it's ours, and turning it into a nationalist issue. As anti-communism was losing a little steam and racism was losing steam in the Republican Party, Reagan, and this is interesting given what's going on now, went for nationalism. And his issue was the canal. And he almost won the nomination in 1976 on the Panama Canal Treaty. The Joint Chiefs of Staff said that if we had not approved these treaties, which 2/3 of the country was against, and it required a 2/3 vote in the Senate, the heaviest of heavy political lifts, we would have had an ongoing guerrilla war in Central America. Because once they said it would have required 100,000 troops in perpetuity. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, but I actually was persuaded that this was the case, because once a saboteur, a terrorist, if you want to call it, did something to the canal, actually tried to blow something up, then because it's the major artery of commerce in the Western Hemisphere, we would have had to put a bunch of troops there to guard the canal, make sure that it wasn't blown up. And
Jonathan, let me ask you contextually though, why did that issue from the perspective of Latin Americans, why did that issue come to a crescendo at that point? I mean, after all, we built the canal in the early 20th century, owned it and managed it. Why at that point in history was the canal such a flashpoint and essentially a casus belli at that point? What was going on in Latin America?
Because it was all tied up with US imperialism and, gringo go home. And it was a sign of, we consider the canal zone for the first, 80 years a part of the United States.
Right.
And this was seen as being a gaping wound in the psyche of not just Panamanians, but anybody in Latin America. And the human rights policy and many of the other positive developments in our relations in Latin America, a lot of them flowed out of the fact that Carter had done this. And so, yes, there was a problem later, in Central America, and we can talk about how Carter talked Daniel Ortega into leaving office when he was a former president, and Bush invaded Panama when Noriega was in charge. So it's not like all problems ended, but in general, after the canal treaties were approved, we had a dramatic improvement in our relations in the Western Hemisphere. And it's also a really fun perils of Pauline political story in terms of how Carter, with the help of people like John Wayne, who was in favor of the treaties, won approval of these pivotal treaties.
Right. Very good. Well, I want to move on to what most people who know little about Carter know something about in terms of his major achievement at Camp David and basically brokering the Egyptian-Israeli peace. You described the process as elongated, in some sense agonizing. Can you tell us about it? There's a lot to say there. And I want to talk about the aftermath. I mean, I'm particularly interested and remain upset that Israel has become subsequently so hostile to Jimmy Carter. I want to talk a little bit about, it's a footnote, but I think an important one that extends to this day. Don't quite understand it. I mean, Egypt is almost half the Arab world, and there has not since Camp David been a single bullet exchanged between the Israelis and Egyptians, and militarily gives Israel a tremendous step up, and it is a great basically augmentation of their security in the Middle East, which has always been an existential concern and anxiety of great measure for Israel. I want you to talk about the Camp David Accords, if you can, and the aftermath, if you will.
Yeah, so I'm Jewish, and when I was growing up, it was always Israel is in danger of being driven into the sea. We
Right.
heard that all the time. I'm sure you did too. Never hear that. Haven't heard that for the last 40 years, because the only army with the power to destroy Israel was the Egyptian army, and they had fought 4 wars in 30 years at the time of Camp David. Now, some people say, well, it wasn't Jimmy Carter, it was Anwar Sadat going to Israel before Carter brought them to Camp David, but that's just flat wrong historically. And as Begin said after they came back from Camp David, he said these are the Jimmy Carter Accords, and they wouldn't have been possible without him, even though they left him out of the Nobel Prize, which Carter got many years later, which is a whole other story. But the Carter was the most pro-Palestinian president we've ever had. He's also the only president who didn't win a majority of the Jewish vote, in his case in 1980. But he did more for the security of the state of Israel, as you mentioned, than any president since Harry Truman, who recognized Israel's right to exist. And I think the inability of American Jews and some Israelis at the time and in the years since to recognize this is a sign of their short-sightedness. Now, Carter himself, credits Moshe Dayan and other key Israelis with helping him get this accord done. Both Begin and Sadat threatened to leave Camp David on more than one occasion, blowing the whole thing up. They were so they disliked each other so much that Carter realized after the first of what turned out to be 13 days there that he couldn't have them in the room at the same time. So he had to shuttle back and forth. And this was, first of all, when I did this, I thought that Teddy Roosevelt had done this in settling the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, but actually Roosevelt was in Oyster Bay. He wasn't in the room with the Russians and the Japanese. And Carter, I interviewed Henry Kissinger about this, and he obviously had critical things to say about Carter on Iran, where Kissinger was wrong. But that's another story. But he gave him like huge credit on Camp David, because he said that he had advised Carter, don't do this. Don't put the prestige of the presidency on the line. You don't do your own negotiations. That's what your Secretary of State does. The stakes are too high to do this. And Carter didn't listen to him, and he got it done. And this, it is, I didn't know before I worked on this book, and astonished me. So after the Camp David Accords, which were in September of 1978, they were not the actual treaty, which required more work. And it started to fall apart, in part because Begin told American Jews that he'd given up too much. He felt bad about it. And the whole thing seemed like it was dead after Camp David. And Carter decides in March of 1979 that he's going to go to the region and he's going to rescue the, the deal. And he's told, again, not just by Kissinger and people in the other party, but by his own staff, don't do this. It's not going to work. Camp David is dead. Get used to it. He defies them because he's a very stubborn individual in many ways. He goes, he puts the whole thing back together with chewing gum and baling wire and masking tape. And then they have the signing ceremony on the White House lawn. So this was a world-class achievement. Averell Harriman, who had been Roosevelt's ambassador to the Soviet Union and a very important figure in American mid-century American history, said it was the greatest diplomatic triumph in American history. And this is by a guy who is just detested. But then after that, he gets very frustrated by the fact that they didn't get a two-state solution out of Camp David. And he does a lot of things after leaving the presidency that upset Israel, like meeting with Hamas. The reason he's meeting with Hamas, he's trying to get them on the same page as the Palestinian Authority so that they can have one negotiating partner with Israel. And it wasn't successful, but every time he would try to do something, and many of the things he said that were critical of Israel grew out of his frustration. So over time, his relationship with the Jewish community in Israel worsened, especially in 2006 when he wrote a book called Palestine Peace or Apartheid. And if you use that word apartheid and you're not in the Israeli Knesset, where it's fine to use it, but if you're a Christian or non-Jew and you're using it, you're going to cause yourself a lot of problems, which
it was actually quite extraordinary. Just, speaking personally, it opened my eyes, Camp David did, to how you can take long-standing enmities between peoples and nations and actually bring them to successful conclusions in peace through interpersonal discussion. It's something I remember listening to George Mitchell and how he had brokered the Good Friday Accords in Northern Ireland. It really opens your eyes to what adept persons can do, sitting around a table talking about it and negotiating it and really bringing an end to what are deep-rooted, seemingly chronic, unending, hostilities between peoples. It's really quite an eye-opening experience about
doesn't work.
the role of diplomacy. It's really quite something.
It's amazing. It doesn't work all the time. Maybe it doesn't work most of the time. The timing has to be right. The players have to be right. So Carter and Sadat had a very, very close personal relationship, which helped a lot. And Carter and Begin at Camp David appreciated each other's skills, which helped a lot. And so you do have to have that personal thing going, but you also have to have the right timing. So for instance, the timing's not right now between Ukraine and Russia. So Trump comes in there and says, well, I could settle this in 24 or 48 hours. It's the most preposterous thing imaginable.
Yeah. Okay. I want to move on to human rights, which is something I know a little bit about. And so I teach human rights in the university. And, And Jimmy Carter, of course, is part of the syllabus. I would argue he was the best friend to human rights we've ever had in the White House before or after. And I do recall when he gave his inauguration speech on, I guess, January 20th, 1981, that he
77.
Oh, 77. I'm sorry. Of course, 77, that he basically said that human rights would be the centerpiece of American foreign policy. And again, most people probably didn't know what he was talking about. But it seems to me that one can't make human rights the centerpiece of foreign policy, given realpolitik and American security interests and so on. Human rights are aspirational and they have to be compromised given realities. And that seemed to be the case with Carter, that his policy, despite the best of intentions, was by necessity basically not uniformly applied. There were inconsistencies. I mean, he seemed to be better supporting individuals who were in trouble prisoners of conscience, as Amnesty International refers to them, rather than uniform policies with regard to nations. Give us a brief summary of Carter's human rights policy. Let me just say, I have to say that Jimmy Carter deserves more than anyone else credit for basically creating the human rights culture. I mean, now human rights is a necessary aspect of international parlance and negotiation. You never heard of it before. I think Franklin Roosevelt was the first president to have ever used the term. Now it's all over the place. And we have tens of thousands of human rights NGOs and so on and so forth. I think Carter deserves credit more than anyone of having basically initiated the human rights culture, regardless of how he may have applied it inconsistently on the ground during the presidency. But tell us about that. What is your perspective on Carter?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, I did word searches for human rights, and it started to get used a little more around the time of the Helsinki
Yeah, 75. Yeah.
75
Right.
when
Yeah.
Gerald Ford was president.
Right.
But then it goes like this when Carter becomes president, and he from right after his inauguration, he starts speaking up for Sakharov and Andrei Sakharov and the other prisoners of conscience in the Soviet Union, and he appoints the first ever Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights, a woman, Patricia Darian.
Patricia Darian, as I recall. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Right.
she was a very important figure in all of this. Somebody should write a biography of her. And they didn't always get along that well for the reasons that you mentioned, which is that this is taking place in the middle of what is still a Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. And so there were, even though Carter was providing support for Soviet dissidents way beyond what Nixon, Ford, and Kissinger did, and retreating from their policy of détente in terms of a lot of what he said about human rights in the Soviet Union. They didn't care about human rights. Kissinger didn't care about human rights at all. So this is a big change, but despite that, there are strategic issues that come to the fore. So at one point, at the end of his first year as president, Carter travels to Tehran and he toasts the Shah of Iran as being a, quote, island of stability in the Middle East. And he was not obviously an island of stability, because he, by early 1979, just a little more than a year later, he's gone. But it gives you some sense of what the geostrategic balance was at that time. And Iran was, which borders, the Soviet Union, was a bulwark through every administration since World War II. And in fact, in 1953, we put the Shah back on the throne after one of his democratically elected prime ministers got a little too democratic. And
you talking about Mossadegh and
Mossadegh.
Yeah, right.
Mossadegh.
Yeah.
So the context did not really allow Carter to apply a consistent human rights standard. It was a somewhat hypocritical, or at least inconsistent standard. But this is something that I think a lot of younger people and students really need to understand maybe better. Not all of them, but some of them. And it was encapsulated by something that Barack Obama liked to say, which is, you cannot make the perfect the enemy of the good. So just because it wasn't a perfect human rights policy, and they're supporting Marcos in the Philippines, and
Salvador, right? I mean, what didn't support
Salvador was, I think, yes, but Carter in Central America, Carter, Somoza fled when he was the despotic leader of Nicaragua when Carter was president. Carter didn't do anything to prop up Somoza. I mean, he gave some rhetorical support to the regimes in Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, but very little. In other words, he was quite different from the way the Reaganites approached it. Although interestingly, they did not end his human rights policy. They ran against it, and then they continued it in the same way that when Reagan became president, they didn't reverse the Panama Canal treaties, even though that was what had brought Reagan to prominence. So they continued this, as did every other administration. And George W. Bush, his entire second inaugural is all about democracy building in the Middle East. So the seeds that Carter planted were very significant, and in some cases they saved lives. So when, for instance, Kim Dae-jung, who became the president of South Korea, when Carter was president, he was in prison, and when Carter went to Seoul, he talked to the then strongman of South Korea, you've got to let these political prisoners out. And later, years later, when he was inaugurated as president of South Korea, Pat Darien went to the inauguration, and President Kim Dae-jung said to her, "You and Jimmy Carter saved my life." And this was true in different regions of the world. And where they didn't save their lives, they gave them inspiration. So Václav Havel spoke in later years about he's in prison when Carter's president, but he knows he has a friend in the United States. He knows that there's hope because there's some support from Washington. And these things are extraordinarily important for what became a democratic revolution around the world. We now think that we're entering this period of intense nationalism, in some cases Christian nationalism, and it's a real danger. And I'm not minimizing it, but if you look at the number of nations in the world that are democratic versus autocratic now compared to 40 years ago, there are way more democracies.
Well, you did mention
Not
Latin
all
America.
attributable to Jimmy Carter, but Jimmy Carter helped set that off. And I talked to people in places like Argentina, to human rights activists, and to a person, they had enormous respect for what Jimmy Carter did.
Well, we could argue, and you did make the point earlier, Jonathan, that Latin America has almost totally flipped.
Yeah.
I mean, they were all autocracies, military dictatorships before and after Jimmy Carter. All of them have become now, unfortunately, with the aggression of Venezuela, have all in effect become democracies. Some troubled, but in effect democracies nevertheless. And Jimmy Carter, I think, can deserve a lot of credit for that.
Yeah. And in his post-presidency, interestingly, it became more complicated because Carter believed that if you had to choose between peace and human rights, you should choose peace. And so he felt like you couldn't address human rights until the bullets stopped flying. And he actually had a very sharp worded meeting with leaders from the human rights community in 1994. That year, Carter prevented wars as a former president in both Haiti and North Korea. But the human rights community felt that he had kissed up to Cedras, the dictator of Haiti. And Carter was like, I was preventing the United States from invading, which he was. He convinced Cedras to leave, but often he would subordinate human rights to peacemaking, and this could cause problems with the human rights community. But
before we leave international issues, we have to talk about the hostage crisis,
right,
which of course many people remember. Some people credit ABC News and Ted Koppel with the downfall of Jimmy Carter, and there may be some truth in that, right? You could do that. Talk to us, and he had a troubled relationship with the Shah. Talk to us about the hostage crisis and what it was and the fallout.
Well, despite the fact that it ended well with the hostages all coming home safe and sound, which Carter said was his priority because saving lives has always been his priority. So he doesn't actually see the hostage crisis as a fiasco because it ended well. And he said one of the happiest days of his life was a couple days after Reagan
He
takes
got
off.
peace rather than human rights. Okay.
Well,
It's a
he
different
got them
context.
out. I mean,
Right.
he was never going to get human rights
Right.
because the Iranian Revolution, which is the most important revolution of the 20th century, with the exception of the Russian Revolution, but in terms of its after effects, it's right up there with
Yes.
the Russian Revolution. And, Kissinger and I kind of clashed a little bit on this because he had this view that Carter could have prevented the Shah from falling. And after a very close look at this, I concluded that that was not true. But then Carter, he was famously criticized for excessive attention to detail. I'm sure that you've heard that critique. But in the case of the Camp David Accords, the Panama Canal treaties, normalization with China, the Alaska Lands Bill, which doubled the size of the national park system, on and on. That attention to detail was what gave him his big successes. In the case of Iran, he was so distracted by putting together the post Camp David treaty. He was preparing for Deng Xiaoping's visit to Washington. He didn't apply his normal attention to the emerging Iranian revolution, and he didn't really sense its importance. He thought maybe the Ayatollah would stay in the holy city of Qom. He was not imaginative in bolstering the interim president, who was a moderate, a guy named Bakhtiar, who was between the Shah and Khomeini. And he arguably kind of messed up Iran policy early on. And then in October of 1979, he made a huge mistake. So the biggest mistake of his presidency. So you remember I said that he said, fuck the Shah. This was when Kissinger and Rockefeller and all these people were telling him, let the Shah into the United States. The Shah is going from country to country, and countries like the UK wouldn't let him in. And the United States, Carter didn't want him there. And he finally, he's saying, fuck the Shah. I don't want him here. This is going to be a real problem for us if he comes here. Then what happens is the Shah's illness, his cancer, becomes known to the US government in the fall of 1979. And Rockefeller's people pull the wool over Carter's eyes, and they convince him, with the help of people in the State Department, that the Shah cannot be treated for his cancer in Mexico, which is where he was. So Carter, as a humanitarian gesture, lets the Shah come to New York for cancer treatment. And just a few days after he does that, the students seize the embassy in Tehran. There's a cause and effect there between Carter's decision to let the Shah in and the takeover of the embassy. Yes. And then once the embassy is taken over, Carter allows himself to be taken hostage. And as Ted Koppel and other people told me, yes, it's Koppel and Walter Cronkite who saying it's the 178th day of captivity for the U.S. hostages in Iran. They contributed to it by focusing on it so much, but they were so focused on it in part because Carter was. And Carter said to the families, I will do anything to make sure your loved ones come home in one piece. So the Ayatollah is looking at this and is going, we've got Carter over a barrel. And they essentially hold Carter hostage in the White House. And it goes on for 444 days. And whether there was an October surprise, meaning did the Reaganites, collaborate with the Iranians the Ayatollah's people to prevent the hostages from being released before the election. I just co-wrote an article in the New Republic just a few weeks ago saying, yes, that effort was made by William Casey, who was Reagan's campaign manager. Whether a final deal, an actual deal was struck, we'll never know. There are no documents, but it's quite clear that the Reagan campaign at least made the effort, and it was successful because the hostages were not released before the election when there were
It's an
several.
awful thing. Yeah, the New York Times had a recent story on that of a guy who was
Yeah,
actually witnessed those discussions to
yeah,
verify he's in his 80s now, who was
yeah.
there. It's actually rather despicable that
It is
Americans
despicable.
would basically, right, their hostage situation, which was horrible, would be prolonged for the sake of political expediency. But that's another side point. I wish we had a lot more time to talk about this. We're going to have to bring this to a close. Just one more thing about the hostage crisis. You basically, and it was really fascinating, provide in detail the circumstances around that ill-fated effort to try to rescue the hostages, right? I mean, did they really believe that they could pull that off? I mean, it
Well,
really, and it failed. I just want to mention one thing that I think viewers ought to know. Fewer soldiers died in combat under Jimmy Carter's presidency or in military situations than any president of the 20th century. Only 8, and they were associated with the helicopter failure in the desert in Iran, trying to rescue the hostages. Interesting fact, and I'm wondering. I guess it was Brzezinski primarily who had fomented that scheme. Did they really think it was going to work? I mean, it seems so incredibly difficult and extravagant, and it failed. I was wondering if you could talk about the rescue mission a little
so
bit.
first of all, the number of American service personnel who died in combat under Carter was 0.
0, but this was a
So
military. I
yeah,
meant under a
yeah,
military scenario.
it's
Yeah,
kind of amazing because it's not just the 20th century. You literally have to go back to the administration of Thomas Jefferson
right.
to find a time when nobody in the U.S. military was
Well,
killed.
he was not a pacifist, but I would like to believe he was pacifistically oriented.
He was
So,
pretty.
yeah,
He was pretty close to a pacifist.
right.
And in terms of, but he knew that the rescue mission would likely lead to American casualties. When you look back at it, it looks like a Rube Goldberg
Yeah.
contraption of an idea. I don't think it would have worked, but Carter was convinced by the U.S. military that they had a shot and that the plan was solid. He actually and Brzezinski urged them to add a couple more helicopters, but they were still 2 helicopters short of what they needed because one helicopter had to turn back in a sandstorm, another one malfunctioned, and then because of that they didn't have enough helicopters to go from the desert to Tehran to try to extract the hostages from the embassy. And so they aborted the mission. And then after the mission was aborted, which was bad enough, when they're taking off to go back to the aircraft carrier and leave the desert, a helicopter crashes into a C-130 troop transport, which is what they were going to take from the desert landing zone meeting point into Tehran, and 8 servicemen were killed. So there's 2 just horrible pieces of news in one night, and Carter is in there in the Oval Office with his head in his hands. And I have a blow by blow, it's quite dramatic account of what was happening that evening on the ground in Iran and in Washington. That, of course, sets back the efforts to negotiate their release. The hostages are then spread around Tehran so that there was no ability to return and try another military operation.
Mhm.
And it in retrospect, it looks crazy. And Bob Gates, who was in the room at the time, who later became Secretary of Defense under Bush and Obama, when the Obama White House is talking about going in and killing Osama bin Laden, Gates is against it because he said, we tried this with helicopters. It failed. Fortunately, even though a helicopter malfunctioned in 2011 as well, the mission was a success, but it came close to failure. Whenever you're using helicopters, the thing we learned in Vietnam, and they should have known in Delta Force, is that helicopters don't work very well. They're really subject to malfunction, and we lost a lot of men in Vietnam because of bad
Sure,
helicopters.
and we have remember Black Hawk Down, right, in
Black
Somalia, and
Hawk
how easy
Down.
they were to shoot down, right?
Yeah.
So forth. Anyway, I want to bring this to a close, but I have to deal with and some concluding thoughts of the post-presidency of Jimmy Carter and other thoughts you may have. But I want to get back to one domestic issue, which I think is very important. You mentioned it in passing, and that was Jimmy Carter's commitment to environmentalism and conservation. As you note in the book, very interesting, he's the first president to really identify global warming as a problem. And here we are today, and that is the big existential issue that we confront. And yet he was, in some ways, a precursor in that regard. So can you talk to us about his environmental and conservation commitments, which is,
So
I think, in some ways, part of his most lasting legacy?
yeah, he grew up as an outdoorsman and has been an outdoorsman
Mhm.
his whole life. And even now, he's in hospice, he still tries to go outside. And so since his exposure to these ideas, which a lot of them were through this illiterate black field hand who would take him fishing, he was a strong believer in this long before it became very fashionable. And he protected a number of rivers when he was governor of Georgia that Georgians now enjoy. And I found from that time the journal Nature, a scientific journal, and they had an article about carbon pollution, as it was called, or sometimes global warming. It was just being discussed in the scientific community. And I found in Carter's files from when he was governor, he was underlining 1971. He's underlining this article and learning about it. And then when he becomes president, the first toxic waste cleanup, the first funding for green energy, the first legislation that incentivizes public utilities to use green energy. You could go right down the list of things that he did, new amendments to the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act, and I mentioned the Alaska Lands Bill. He had something called the Council on Environmental Quality, and they would issue reports, and then those reports would be turned into legislation, which almost always passed. Well, at the very end of his administration, the Council of Environmental Quality issued a report that was in the New York Times, buried in the New York Times, that said that we must deal with this problem of global warming. And this was the first time any government anywhere in the world discussed the issue. It had been in the scientific community. And it recommended that our carbon emissions come down by precisely what the Paris Climate Accords did in 2015. It was, when I saw this, it blew my mind, because this is in 1980 and 81. This is 35 years earlier. We knew the right thing to do. Carter wanted to go to electric cars by the middle of his second term. I don't think the battery technology would have allowed us to do this. He was pro coal because coal was the way for us to achieve energy independence. But he was also, as indicated by his putting the solar panels on the roof of the White House, he was very focused on alternative energy, and he would have been motivated to have us set on a course of policymaking that took climate change into account.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're going to have to bring this to a close in a moment or two, but we have to spend a little bit of time on Carter's post-presidency that won him the Nobel Prize, his work, tremendous work with disease in Africa, his commitment to democracy, and so on and so forth. So if you could just give us a few words about Jimmy Carter up to the moment.
So I think the important thing to understand first is that he's become a global icon, and for good reason, and his contributions as a former president are very significant. He reinvented the idea of what a former president can do. But it's important to understand that when you're a former president, you don't really have any power the way you do as a president. And so if you're talking about truly changing lives, you really can should focus on things like guinea worm disease, where he has come close to, or the Carter Center's efforts have come close to eradicating this disease that afflicted millions of people, particularly in Africa, and now it ruined their lives, in some cases cost them their lives, and now it is almost eradicated. It's in the number of cases is in double digits and close to eradication. Same thing with river blindness, another terrible disease. So on global health, he's he's made these great achievements on peacekeeping, mostly in the year 1994 when he prevented wars in Haiti and North Korea, but really ticked off President Clinton by grandstanding a little bit on CNN before he came back to report the president. So I have a chapter called Freelance Secretary of State, when he's yes, he's technically checking in with the government, but he's causing his successors a lot of heartburn by the way he operated. Or I interviewed George H.W. Bush not long before he died, and he had very positive things to say about Jimmy Carter, except that in 1991, Carter wrote all the members of the Security Council and told them not to support Bush on the Gulf War, invading Kuwait. And you know, this, understandably, we only have one president at a time, and this was a legitimate criticism, but he did great work. The Carter Center continues to do great work monitoring and supervising elections all over the world. And as far as Habitat for Humanity goes, which is not run by the Carter Center, is not something that Jimmy Carter himself did, except that he chaired the board for many years, and he, 1 week a year, he would go somewhere in the world and build a house. And I built a house with him in Memphis in 2016. And this had a very profound effect on the growth of Habitat for Humanity, which is now the largest builder of nonprofit housing for the poor in the world. And so you have to credit Carter with helping put them on the map, even though he wasn't actually running that particular organization.
Yeah. Well, it's an extraordinary life and an extraordinary legacy. Very sadly, Carter, of course, is in his last days. We know that he's in hospice. 97 years old? Is he?
No, he's
Yes.
98. He'll turn 99 on October
Oh
1st.
my goodness. Right.
And
Even older.
he's
Yeah.
so I'm in pretty close touch with his family and
Uh-huh.
his circle, and you know, he could go tomorrow, or he could live months longer. He doesn't have his the cancer that he got in 2015 was, by his account, you know, eradicated through a combination of a drug called Keytruda and a lot of prayer, as he said to me for a New Yorker piece that I wrote about that particular situation. And so he is um, still there mentally, which I think a lot of people understandably wonder about. So he's watching things unfold, but his communication with the outside world is obviously not what it used to be. Just 5 years ago, he was traveling all over the world, still fishing, making peace, meeting foreign leaders. Even tried to deal with Putin in Syria and getting him to back off some of what he was doing in Syria. So this is a man who touched and saved more lives than almost any other American president. And while he does not belong on Mount Rushmore, his contributions have been badly underestimated and underappreciated. And his core decency and moral leadership should be an inspiration for people of all generations.
Well, that's a beautiful point at which we can end our discussion, Jonathan. It's been absolutely incredibly informative and very, very important. And I just want to remind our viewers again about the book, His Very Best, Jimmy Carter: A Life, by journalist and writer Jonathan Alter. I encourage you to get it and to read it. It's an excellent read. It's extremely informative. And I want to thank you again, Jonathan Alter, for the time you've spent this afternoon and
Thank you
talking
so
about
much
Jimmy
for
Carter.
having me.
It's been a real privilege and a real pleasure. Thank you very much, and goodbye to you all. Have a good day. Bye-bye.